All right, I think we have everyone in here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for the Humanities Collaboration Grant webinar. My name is Jenny Knable. I am a program manager here for the Iowa Arts Council and the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs. We also have production assistant EJ Philby Burton on the webinar today, who will help with any technical assistance that we might need. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Closed captioning is available for this presentation. You can enable it now by clicking the closed captioning CC button at the bottom of your screen. All the lines are muted and will be for the duration of the presentation to reduce background noise as this webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording of the webinar will be emailed to all registrants, and it will be posted on our website at iowaculture.gov/humanities. There you can also find program information and the resources mentioned in this webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in Zoom. You may also use this feature if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, and staff will assist you with Q&A throughout the presentation. However, we'll also take time at the end to answer any questions you may have. And then I also note that the chat is disabled, so make sure you're using Q&A if you have questions. All right, so let's move into the agenda, which is our next slide. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. The purpose of today's presentation is to familiarize you with the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the Iowa Arts Council, and our role in administering the grants that are supported by state and federal government, to provide an overview of this grant program, its goals and eligibility, and then to walk through the application requirements and how to successfully submit a proposal using the online application system. All right, now let's take a look at an overview of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs. The Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs has three divisions: the State Historical Society of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, and Produce Iowa, the State Office of Media Production. The mission of our department is to empower Iowa to build and sustain culturally vibrant communities by connecting Iowans to the people, places, and points of pride that define our state. In 2020, the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs was named the interim State Humanities Council by the National Endowment for the Humanities and has received the State Partnership Grant. We administer funding, networking, and learning opportunities that support arts, culture, and humanities across Iowa. So a little bit more about our funding sources. Funding for our work in this program comes from the federal government through the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the state government through an annual appropriation from the Iowa legislature to the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs. The takeaway here is that the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs work, including the Humanities Collaboration Grant, is funded with taxpayer dollars. So the public value of what we do is an essential component of our programs, especially our grant programs. In the past few years have brought to the forefront historic inequities in arts and humanities funding faced by many individuals, organizations, and communities. Therefore, the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs is continuing to focus on equity and inclusion across all of our programs and will place additional consideration on applicants from cultural organizations that represent populations that have historically been under-resourced by arts and culture and humanities funding due to rural geography, race and ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. The definitions and criteria for meeting these priorities can be found in our grants, terms, and definitions on our website. Applications from all eligible applicants are encouraged, regardless of whether or not you meet these criteria. All right, let's take a look at the application timeline for the Humanities Collaboration Grant. This will give you an idea of what to expect in terms of turnaround and communication for the program after the application. Please note that all reference communication is sent via email, so it is important to provide current contact information in all materials. The deadline to apply for this program is December 1st. Once applications are submitted, they will undergo a review by staff for eligibility. Eligible applicants will be sent to a panel review. The panel will submit funding recommendations to the director of the department and the administrator of the Iowa Arts Council. They will consider the panel recommendations and the department funding priorities to make final funding decisions. All applicants will be notified of funding decisions either way by December 31st. Funding decisions are final and may not be appealed due to dissatisfaction. Those who receive funding will receive a contract and more information on how to manage the award at that time. Grant recipients will be able to expend funds on expenses that incurred between November 1st through June 30 of 2023. This is also the time period in which you have to complete your grant activity. As you may have noticed, the funding period does begin prior to being notified of a funding decision. This allows applicants to include related project expenses that you may have already incurred since it is a short funding period. So you can include any expenses incurred after November 1st. All grant recipients will have to complete a final report by August 1st, 2023 to close out your grant award. Now, some more information on how to apply. As with any of our grant programs, it is important to determine whether the program is the right fit for you. To do so, make sure you have reviewed all available material before applying. Please note that the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs grant process is entirely paperless. All grant program materials are available online, and all communication will be sent via email. We do have an accessibility coordinator on staff for anyone who needs assistance with the application process. So our first step is to go to the Interim Humanities Council's website at iowaculture.gov/humanities. There you'll find a link to download guidelines for the specific grant program that you're looking to apply for. Each of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs administered grant programs have a different set of requirements and guidelines that applicants must follow. Please make sure that you closely read and understand these guidelines. The guidelines also include a scoring rubric so you can see how an application will be evaluated. You will also need to read the funding policies, which cover the rules and requirements for grant programs as a whole. The third step is to visit the application portal at iowaartscouncil.slideroom.com. Here you'll be able to view a summary of application requirements by clicking on the link to the program that you wish to apply for. To view the full application requirements, you must create an account on SlideRoom and log in. After logging in, you will have access to the narrative questions, character limits, and upload requirements. All material must be submitted online via SlideRoom. The Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs does not accept any materials submitted via mail or email, nor does it accept late material after deadline has passed, unless requested by a staff member. And the final step, once you have reviewed all of the available material, you can contact staff or attend one of our virtual office hours to ask any remaining questions you may have. Office hours are open Zoom meetings where applicants can drop in to ask questions about applying for a grant. The schedule for these meetings will be available on our website, and we'll share it at the end of this presentation today. All right, now let's take a look at the goals and general eligibility requirements for the Humanities Collaboration Grant Program. The Humanities Collaboration Grant offers support for public humanities projects that encourage contemplation, spark conversation, and engage the community through collaboration with another nonprofit organization, institution of higher education, or a school. Eligible projects will use the humanities as the central resource to involve and benefit diverse groups of Iowans through educational programming that explore the human experience. The projects must have a clear beginning and end date within the eligible funding period. So here are some examples of eligible projects. Eligible projects should focus on the humanities and must demonstrate public value to Iowans through deliberate public engagement and access to project activities. Types of eligible projects could include things like community discussions, lecture series, workshops, documentary films, interpretive exhibits, podcasts, etc. Projects that involve the creative or performing arts could be eligible as long as they are a catalyst in a project in which the humanities are central, or include interpretation and or discussion of performances, concerts, literary works, etc. A competitive project will demonstrate fresh thinking and new ideas as opposed to regular or ongoing programming. Applicants can only apply for support of annual events or series if the applicant can demonstrate how the project is unique and worthy of support within this particular funding period. Project content must change from year to year. So many people wonder how we define the humanities. Well, the humanities are defined as including but not limited to modern and classical language, linguistics, literature, history, philosophy, archaeology, jurisprudence, comparative literature, ethics, the history and criticism and theory of the arts, those aspects of social sciences which have humanistic content and employ humanistic methods, and the study and application of the humanities to the human environment with particular attention to reflecting our diverse heritage, traditions, and history, and to the relevance of the humanities to the current conditions of national life. The Humanities Collaboration Grants cannot fund the creation or the performance of art, creative writing, autobiographies, memoirs, and creative nonfiction, quantitative social science research, or policy studies, or applied science. If you have any further questions about what we mean by the humanities, you can always reach out and ask as you're working on your application. All right, let's look at the program overview. Eligible projects must involve a humanities expert. They could be someone with an advanced degree in humanities discipline or someone who is otherwise well qualified to bring a humanities perspective to a project, such as a historian, librarian, or museum professional, culture bearer, or individual who has an acknowledged cultural expert within their community. The humanities expert on the project could be an employee of the applicant if they have the required expertise. They could also be part of the collaborating organization that you're working with on the project. The humanities expert should be engaged with the project during the application process. Prior to submitting an application, the humanities expert and applicant should discuss the project and formulate ways to strengthen the humanities aspects of the project, explore involvement of additional experts who may offer diverse perspectives, and review the application to help clarify goals and methodology. During the grant project, the humanities expert could serve as a speaker or a panelist or lead a discussion. They could offer ongoing advice or guidance on your project. They can review materials for authenticity and diversities of perspectives or assist with project evaluation at the end. So in addition to the humanities expert, projects also need to have a collaboration partner. So the collaboration partner, as I mentioned earlier, could be another nonprofit organization, it could be an institution of higher education or pre-K-12 school. And the collaborating partner should work with the applicant on the development and implementation of the project activities that are tied to the core theme and provide Iowans opportunities to deeply engage with the subject matter. Partners can be from the same town or community or county, or they can even be more regionally or statewide based. But it needs to be clear in the application that the partner will make meaningful contributions to the project activities and that they too will benefit from the project. They should not simply serve as a venue to host programming or as an entity that's just getting paid to participate. They should be actively involved in the project itself. So let's look at some ineligible project types. So here's a list of some ineligible projects. They include things like capital projects, collection, maintenance, or restoration, construction or renovation of a property, domestic travel dominant projects that primarily benefit the applicant, fundraiser or benefit events, lobbying activities, non-humanities related projects, ongoing projects or programming for which an identified beginning or end is arbitrary. Projects that involve domestic travel outside of Iowa must clearly demonstrate how the activities benefit Iowans and the humanities community in Iowa. Projects that involve research solely for scholarly purposes are not allowed. Projects that are intended primarily for students, faculty members, or other on-campus or in-school audiences are not allowed. Projects that occur prior to or after the funding period, projects that have already received an Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs grant for any part or phase of the project, any religious activities, performance-only programming, or art classes focusing only on creative techniques. Now let's look one more time at the funding period. Applications to the Humanities Collaboration Grant are accepted on December 1st for the funding period of November 1st, 2022 through June 30 of 2023. By the funding period, we do mean that all fiscal and project activity has to occur within that eligible time period. The project must be completed, the grant funds spent, and the required match met within that time frame. Please note that there is only one deadline for this grant program. Interested applicants can only submit one application during that December 1st deadline. Projects may only receive one grant from the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, regardless of the phase of the project. So make sure you apply at the appropriate time in the life cycle of your project. Applicants may not submit more than 2 unfunded applications for the same project, regardless of the fiscal year. So if your application is not funded a second time, you may not submit another application for that specific project. So for this grant program, applicants can request between $2,500 to $30,000 to support one-time expenses that are essential to the completion of the Humanities project. And these can include expenses such as honoraria for the Humanities Expert, speaker fees, contracted project personnel, domestic travel, which that could include things like mileage, accommodation, or per diem, marketing expenses, so things like print material, ad buys, design fees, materials necessary for the project, personnel time dedicated to the project, so that could be time spent planning, execution, or evaluating the project, and rentals. Just some things to note are that personnel time, you have to demonstrate how the personnel time is being spent specifically dedicated to the project, and we do not allow benefits to be included as expenses. And then rental expenses cannot be included if the applicant owns the space. So you can't also claim that as part of your match or for the grant request if it's a space that you already own, if you're using it for the project. All right, so this grant does require a match requirement. An applicant must demonstrate at least a 50% cash match to the grant request. So in other words, if you request $5,000 in grant funds, you are responsible for demonstrating that you or another funding source has contributed $2,500 to the project to cover other project expenses for a minimum total project budget of $7,500. All required cash match must be a legitimate part of the proposed project and dedicated to one-time project expenses. The cash does not need to be secured at the time of application, but it does need to be secured by the end of the funding period. You will be expected to demonstrate where you anticipate the cash match to come from and whether or not it is in hand at the time you're submitting the application. Funding from the Department of Cultural Affairs, the state of Iowa, or federal government may not be used to meet this cash match requirement. There are some ineligible expenses that cannot be included in the grant request. So things like lost revenue. So this speaks a little bit back to if you are using your own space, you can't count the rental of that space towards the grant request or the cash match or any other lost revenue. So this would be like providing scholarships to attend events or free admission. We need to actually know the expenses that you have that revenue would otherwise cover. You also can't include museum, school, or library acquisitions, budget shortfalls, capital expenditures, which would include equipment over a total of $5,000 per unit cost, collection maintenance or restoration expenses, deficit or debt reduction, donations or contributions to other organizations, expenses incurred prior to or after the funding period, food, beverage, and alcohol. You can include some food expenses if it's very clear in your application that the food is critical to the project. Otherwise, it cannot be included. So if it's simply offering food at an opening reception of some sort, that wouldn't be a strong enough reason to have food be covered by the grant. But if it's the only way that someone might be able to participate in the program, then it would be an eligible expense. We also cannot cover foreign travel, fundraising or benefit activity expenses, lobbying activity, ongoing or operating expenses, including utilities, rent, lease, office supplies, and personnel time that is not dedicated to the project, personnel benefits, prizes and awards, property maintenance, restoration or renovation, and then any other unallowable expenses that are defined in 2 CFR 200 subpart E cost principles, and we have a link to those in our guidelines. All right, let's look at who's eligible to apply for this grant program. Eligible applicants to the program include federally tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit organizations incorporated and physically located in Iowa. The physical location of the organization is defined as maintaining a current home office and registered agent address in Iowa as defined by Iowa code, as well as maintaining primary staff presence physically located and working in Iowa. Entities located in a border community may be eligible under the border state policy. Also, units of local, county, or federally recognized tribal governments can apply to this grant program. Units within institutions of higher ed that are physically located in Iowa and that have humanities as their core mission and offer public programs are also eligible. However, institutions of higher education are limited to one application for one unit and may not neither apply for nor receive funds for multiple units within the university. So then let's look at the ineligible applicants. These include individuals, public and private schools that serve grades pre-K through 12, state of Iowa government agencies, and with the exception of institutions of higher ed, for-profit corporations or businesses, entities using a fiscal agent or the nonprofit status of another organization, applicants who have already submitted 2 unfunded applications for the same project, Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs grantees who have already received a grant from the department for any part of the project, and Iowa Cultural Affairs grantees with an outstanding final report or who have been placed in a department funding moratorium. All right. Well, that covers eligibility and goals for the program. Now let's take a look at the content of the application. We'll walk through the online portal after this section, but I want to walk you through the content of the application first. So before we begin, I want to remind everyone that the scoring criteria is included in the guidelines found on our website, and it is what the panel will use to review your application. You'll notice that the criteria directly corresponds to each section of the application. So first, there's a handful of application sections that are not scored, but are required for the application to be considered complete. The primary contact information will ask for the contact information for the individual who is submitting the application and who we should contact with any questions. Please make sure the name and email address provided are correct, as all communication will be sent to this person. Then we have the authorized official contact information. And so this should be the contact information for the individual who has the authority to legally obligate the grant applicant. This individual will receive the contract via email and should grant funding be awarded. So again, make sure the name and email address for this person are correct. This may be the same person as the primary contact, or it may be a different individual. Then the applicant information is the contact information for the eligible entity applying. So this should be the actual organization's name under applicant information. So this is the nonprofit or local government submitting the application. And then under this section, you're going to be asked to identify an applicant discipline, which is a new aspect to our grant application, which is different if you've applied to some of our other grant programs before. I'll show you what that looks like when we go through the online application. But this should reflect the organization's focus, not the discipline for the proposed project. And then all applicants will be required to provide a unique entity identifier, or UEI, in the application information. The UEI is a 12-digit alphanumeric character assigned by the federal government at sam.gov, and it is required in order to receive funding through this program. For those who may be familiar with DUNS, this UEI replaces that number this year as the federal identifier. If you need to obtain a number, please visit sam.gov for more information. And if you don't already have a number, I would encourage you to apply for it as soon as possible, because it has taken a while for some organizations to receive their number. Then we get into the project information section, and this will ask you for the start and end date of the project. Be sure that the start and end date fall within the eligible funding period. So it needs to be within November 1st, 2022 to June 30, 2023. And then this section, you'll also be asked what the project title is for your project, as well as a short description. So we're looking for just a 1 to 3 sentence description, high level, of what your project is about, to give panelists a sense of what to expect throughout the rest of your application. You'll also be asked whether or not the project involves placing an artwork on historic property, because if it does, we have to have the project approved by our sister division, the State Historical Society of Iowa. And then finally, in an effort to ensure that the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs programs and services are representative of the diversity of Iowa's humanities community, we've begun to collect demographic information for our applicants. This has allowed us to understand who we are reaching so that we will have a better idea of who we are not. This section is optional and is considered confidential. It will not be reviewed by the panel. However, it will help us to understand whether we are reaching everyone we're hoping to meet across the state. Then we also have the minority impact statement. This is required. This is a required form from the state of Iowa. It asks what, if any, impact the project will have on minority communities. This is also not reviewed by the panel. And then finally, there is the assurances section. This confirms that you have read the program guidelines and to the best of your knowledge have submitted accurate information, and it is a truthful representation of your organization and the project in the application. All right, let's get into the applicant profile. So the first part of the narrative section will be the applicant profile. So in this section, you're going to enter your organization's mission statement, and then you'll want to describe your organization. And that should include talking about the programs and services you offer and how that helps you to fulfill your mission. And then also the target population that your organization typically serves. And then we want you to also include any recent notable achievements so that it demonstrates your ability to successfully implement the proposed project. So the panel is going to look to see whether or not the applicant delivers exceptional humanities programs and that these programs help to advance the applicant's mission and serve their target population. The next section of the application is the project description. This is the what and the why section of the narrative. So in this section, we're going to ask you to describe your humanities project. We want to know why you are developing this project and what community needs or interests will be addressed through this project. And then to help us ensure that the project is in fact humanities-based, we want to know the humanities subject matter that's going to be explored and why you think it is important to Iowa to explore this subject. If the project is part of an annual event or series, we also will want you to describe why this particular year is unique and worthy of funding. The next section is where you're going to talk about the humanities expert you're engaging with in the project. So again, this could be someone working at your organization or at the collaborating organization, or it can be a completely separate individual. In this section, you're going to describe the expert's particular background and research interests that qualify them specifically to be a resource for your project. You'll also need to briefly summarize what role the humanities expert is going to play and their responsibilities within the project and how they're going to be using their expertise. And then finally, you're going to be asked to upload the expert's resume or CV as part of the application. The next section is about the collaboration partner. In this section, you'll describe the organization you're going to be working with on the project. We want to know how the organization will be collaborating with you on this project and why the collaboration is important to the project. We also want to know who from the organization you'll be working with specifically and how they'll be involved in the planning and implementation of the project. We also want to know how the collaborating organization will benefit the project, and their benefit needs, again, to be more substantial than simply being a venue to host programming or just paying them to participate in the project. They need to have some buy-in. They will also need to submit, you will need to submit a one-page letter of support for the project from the organization you're planning to collaborate with. The next section is about public value. So in this section, we want to know who the target audience is for your particular project and how you plan to engage them with the project and provide equitable access to project activities. This section should include information on how you plan to promote the project to ensure that the target audience will know about it and be able to participate. And then we have project planning and implementation. So in this section, you're going to take us through the timeline of tasks that you're going to go through in order for you to complete the project. So we kind of want to get a sense of when you're planning to do what to make sure that the project is accomplished by the end of the funding period. And then in this section, we'll also have you let us know how you plan to evaluate whether or not the project was successful. And then we get into the budget section. So in this budget section, there'll be a couple of tables you'll need to fill out as well as some numbers. So first, we're going to be asking you for the total grant request. So this is the amount of money you're asking to receive in grant funds to help support your project. Then there'll be a table for you to fill out to break down the grant request. So there'll be a table where you'll put an expense description, and you'll want to make sure there's enough information about in that description so the panel knows exactly what expenses are being covered under that line item. So you can joined together like expenses, but just make sure it's clear what you're actually paying for with that amount. So then you'll have the expense and then the amount of grant request that's covering that expense. So that's the first two should just be about the grant request itself. And then we get into the match. So there'll be a line for you to include the total cash match and make sure that that amount is at least half of what you're asking for in the total grant request. And then we'll ask for your total in-kind match. This is not a requirement, but if you do have in-kind support, we'd like you to include it there. And then underneath that, there'll be another table for you to break out those match expenses. So again, we'll have you describe the expense and then put in the total amount for that expense in either under the cash match category or the in-kind category. And then we'll ask you to note whether or not the funding source is secured or if it's still pending. And so at the end of both of those, the grant request table as well as the cash match table, make sure you have one final line that has the total, because that's going to help you check your math to make sure that the breakout of expenses is still equaling that grant request total and that total cash match and total in-kind match are equaling what you have in the table. And then at the very bottom, we'll be asking you to estimate your total project costs. This should be equal to the sum of the grant request, the cash match expenses, and the in-kind contributions that you have listed above in the budget. So the panel is going to look to see that the budget is clear and appropriate and that it leverages multiple sources of match to demonstrate investment in the project. Then we have another area for you to upload some additional support material. So there'll be a media section in the application, and we're asking you to provide 2 to 5 media samples to support your project. So these should provide additional context for the project and speak to the project's quality. So they could be photos, it could be videos, it could be marketing materials, newspaper articles, or it could even be additional letters of support if you're engaging multiple humanities experts, or if you have more than one partner working with you on the project, you could add additional letters of support here, or you could include an evaluation tool you're planning to use to evaluate your project. Please do not include any links to websites or additional narrative here. Panelists will only be required to view 2 pages of each document uploaded or up to 2 minutes of a video uploaded. Also, try to remember to select high quality material that will support the excellence of your project. And then finally, there are 2 other scores that your application will receive that aren't related to a specific section of the application, but the panel will score it based on the proposal as a whole. So in overall importance, the panel will score the application overall on how well the project provides Iowans a humanities service or experience that will have substantial impact on the state. And then finally, the last scoring piece is the case for support. This is where the panel will evaluate the quality of the application overall and whether or not you've made a good, strong case for state support of your project. All right, let's get into the online application. I see we have a few questions in the Q&A. I'll answer those as soon as I get done with the online application. So I'm going to take you into SlideRoom and share my screen to show you the online application itself. But I just want to make a few notes before we get there. So you're going to go to iowaartscouncil.slideroom.com to find the application form. And so just a couple of notes, looking at it in Internet Explorer seems to have a couple of issues displaying SlideRoom. So you may want to use a different web browser if you have any issues. And then we always encourage applicants to write your narrative in a Word doc or a Google Doc to proof for errors before you copy and paste it into your form. But just always proofread your application before submitting, because sometimes in the copy and paste, some of the narrative response gets cut off. So just double check that nothing got cut off if you do that. And then a link to the guidelines are in SlideRoom for your reference, so you can click back to them. And then you'll see each section of it. Let me get into SlideRoom here quick so you can see. So now I can show what it looks like. So just give me a moment to share. Okay, so when you go to iowaartscouncil.slideroom.com, this is the landing page that you'll see. And then you'll see all of our available programs on here. So you're going to want to scroll down to grants. And there you'll see all of the grant programs that we currently have available. So you'll want to click on the FY 2023 Humanities Collaboration Grant. And here's the landing page for this grant program. On this landing page, this is where I had mentioned there's a link to the guidelines if you want to double check them. Also a link to the funding priorities and the 2 CFR Part 200. And then there's also a place where you could preview the full application before you log in. So if you click on that, you can preview all of the forms. And this is all that information that we already kind of talked through during this webinar. But this gives you a sense of what it looks like. If you just want to take a peek at the narrative or if someone's working with you on the application. So now to apply, you're going to have to enter your login information. And sometimes it's saved. Hang on one second. And I got to make sure that I have the right login here. It does ask you to log it in twice. Okay. Oops, this is actually, I'm sorry. You need to log in. If you already have one, you just log in. Otherwise, that was having me try to create another account, which I don't want to do because I already have an account. So if you have an account, you'll have your login and password. Otherwise, you would create an account. So this is what the landing page looks like. Like once you've signed in, you can see your name at the top. And then you can go ahead and begin the application. So as you'll see, when you click onto a field, it has character limits for all the fields, and it'll start to count down as you put characters into each field. So the forms that we kind of went through earlier are all on the left-hand side, and you can click through and preview all of the information. And then where there's uploads within the narrative, you'll see like under Humanities Expert resume or CV, you can just click here to upload the file. And the same thing under the collaboration partner letter of support. Most of the narrative questions are going to have a 2,000 character limit on it. So you can keep that in mind if you're writing your narrative in like a Word doc or Google Doc and copy and paste it. You can always save and exit so you can work on the application and come back to it at any time. The portfolio section is where you'd upload that additional materials for support. And you just click here to add additional materials for whatever information you want to have. And then when you go to submit, obviously here, all of my sections I have not completed. So they'll show these exclamation points next to the section that's missing information. And so you'll know what to go back through. But if all of these were green and good to go, then you'd see a blue submit button and you can submit it once you have completed the application. All right, so that's pretty much the overview of Slide Room. I'm going to stop sharing and have EJ go back to our presentation. All right, so now that we've gone through the application, I just want to give you a heads up on some program assistance, which is on the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have office hours. So these are just open hours on Zoom where we have a set day and time where you can hop in anytime throughout the hour to ask any questions you might be having about your application as you're working on it. So here's the schedule for those. They are going to be at the same day of the week and time as this webinar is. So the next few Wednesdays at 1 p.m. we will not have one during Thanksgiving week, but there will be one the day before the application is due. You're also welcome to reach out if you'd like to see any example applications, although this program is slightly different than the Humanities Project Grant we offered last year, but I could share some successful applications from that grant program if you'd like to see them. Also be sure to look at grant terms and definitions and then who the program staff is. So go ahead and put our contact us information on the screen, EJ. That's the next slide. So there's my contact information. You can always reach out at any time if you have any questions. And then Lindsay Keast is our accessibility coordinator, and she's the one to contact if you're having any issues submitting your application, like maybe you need some help in terms of you doing online work or anything like that. You can reach out to Lindsay and she can offer you some support. So I'm going to take a look at our Q&A. So Elise has asked if there'll be a second round of grant funding for this opportunity that'll occur after June 30. At this time, we don't know if we'll have future rounds. So we are currently the interim Humanities Council. And so we are still waiting to hear from the National Endowment for the Humanities if we will become the full Humanities Council, but our current funding ends on June 30. So we do not know if we will be offering additional rounds of this grant application, of this grant program. So Mary's asking, where does a city's public library fall? Public libraries can apply for this grant program because you would be considered part of city government. So you could be a public library, could be the lead applicant, or they could also be a collaboration partner, either one. And then, yes, there's another question about offering this in the future. We'll hopefully be able to let folks know sometime this spring if we'll be able to offer future rounds of this. But definitely more information to come. And then the in-kind match does not count towards the total required match. We've reduced, our match used to be 1-to-1. We've reduced it to only 50%, but then the 50% has to be cash. So the in-kind is not a requirement anymore, but you could have it if you have in-kind, but it does not count towards the total required match. And then the question is, if the project accumulates in a ticketed event with the goal of generating revenue from the event, would this qualify as a fundraiser or disqualify us from the grant? Just having a ticketed event does not mean it's a fundraiser. So it kind of depends on the purpose of the event. If the event is clearly meant for fundraising, like for example, a gala would not be an eligible event for this grant program. But if it's just a regular program for your organization and not specifically meant to be a fundraiser, then it would be eligible, regardless of whether or not you're charging admission. All right, and then let's see. There's a question of, can one of the participants currently have funding for a different project during this grant cycle? So eligible applicants to this grant program could have funding from another one of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs grants and still apply for funding through this grant program. So if you have FY23 grant funds, either from the State Historical Society of Iowa or the Iowa Arts Council, you can still apply to this Humanities Collaboration Grant program. All right, I will just hang out here for a few more minutes. If anyone else has any other questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, that concludes today's webinar. Again, we will send a recording to everyone who's registered for the webinar, and then feel free to reach out if you have any other questions as you work on your application. The expert can be from the nonprofit applying to the grant. They do not need to be from a different organization. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And again, as always, reach out if you have any additional questions.